this. And I believe everything's going. All right, cool. I'm here with Peter Joseph.
Hey, Chris.
All right, Peter.
Good, man. Good to be here.
Thanks for coming up to Topanga.
Absolutely beautiful out here.
Did you come up from the PCH?
No.
Oh, good. I
yeah.
think it's closed. I forgot to warn
Oh, yeah,
you.
they've been doing construction. Yeah.
No, fire.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a fire a couple days ago. The whole canyon was closed off from the south and the north.
So no one can...
Two fires.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, if you know the back roads, you can get out.
Sure.
But for commuters, it was pretty fucked. Anyway, thanks for coming up.
It does not feel like California, though. It feels like you're in a completely different place. I loved it up here.
Yeah. It's when I tell people I live in LA, they picture something that does not include the red-shouldered hawk out the door that was screaming and owls and coyotes and stuff. But yeah, I love it here.
Nice.
So I've been looking forward to talking to you for a long time. I think there's so much overlap in the kind of work that you're doing and your worldview, and a lot of the raving and ranting that I do in terms of the sort of trajectory of modern culture.
Right.
And I mean, I don't know. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but thank you for sending it to me. It's here. We'll hold it up for the folks who are watching the video. It's the Human Rights Movement. Here it is. It's freshly out. The new Human Rights Movement. Yeah. Reinventing the economy and ending oppression. So what's when people ask you what's the book about, what's your, every author has to come up with their 30 seconds.
Well,
and I have that same look on my face when people ask me that about a book. Like, oh, you want me to compress 3 years of work into 30 seconds?
Well, more like 10 years ultimately when I started this kind of journey to figure out what the hell's going on in society. You know, long story short, if we can't change the economy, we're not going to change human rights, civil relations, and all the oppressive factors that have been with human society, including gender relations, that have been continuing to be this underlying turbulence that have kept people separated, in group, out group. So we have a competitive based economy, and as I argue in the book, and it transcends things that have historically been talked about with respect to, say, Marxism or collectivist versus individualist societies. It's about public health. And if you take a public health perspective, or I'll put it this way, if you were to take all of the peer reviewed literature on what constitutes good psychology, good child upbringing, preconditions that allow for the best of the human condition to come out, not the fear reactions of the lower brain, but the actual prefrontal cortex and our consciousness, our ability to control ourselves, to have incentives that actually reinforce the best of us as opposed to the worst, which is what we're doing now. We can't continue to ignore the nature of our economy anymore. We've been driving the earth into the ground and driving society into destabilization because of a scarcity-driven, dominance-oriented, oppressive economy. Right. And we've conditioned ourselves over the past, especially since kind of the Reagan Thatcher era, as far as the West, that the government, state, and effectively democracy is bad. Because that's really what it implies when you hear people talk about the negative aspects of the state.
Reagan explicitly said the government is the problem.
Yep.
And they wanted to make it small enough to drown in a bathtub.
The illusion that there is no society, I mean, that's a profound
Margaret Thatcher said that explicitly.
And it's completely nonsensical, and it empowers a Machiavellian quality. It empowers an individualistic, in-group, oppressive type of tendency in human culture. And the new human rights movement is about shifting that precondition, shifting the economic focus from a competitive to a collaborative. I'm very specific about it, too. This isn't just conjecture and me talking about broad ideological things that should happen, ideally in the sense that, we can just gesture this, let's just start to work together. No, there are specific things step by step we could do to transition our economy into something very different that support different incentives, different values, and effectively a revolution of the self and a revolution of society. Right. I don't mean that in any kind of metaphysical sense. I'm very literal with this. And again, you take all the public health science, you were to put this into a giant computer that could tell you what the social system would be, that would actually support the best of the human condition. I think the research in that book.
So what would such a social system look like? What are some characteristics? I mean, obviously, you were talking about non-competitive, sort of egalitarian ethos.
Yep. I mean, 99% of human history, as you know, is an egalitarian hunter-gatherer society.
See, I was trying to maneuver you into that. You just turned around and marched right in.
And anyone that says that human
nature outsmart you there.
Well, anyone that says that we are just bound by our psychology, our evolutionary psychology to be these competitive again, that's just patently false and without any regard for history. So we know that we have that inside of us. I mean, what you just said is effectively the broad view. You need incentives for collaboration, not this sort of half incentive of collaboration that's done through competition.
Right.
That's what we have now.
Right.
It's a sort of a pseudo collaboration that happens after the fact.
We get together to fuck the other guys.
And then but we agree to it.
Right.
That's why it's collaborative. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
At the basis of our society is really sharing. But we do it through this proxy mechanism of not sharing initially. So two companies come together, like cell phones. They're constantly making dumb little improvements that they think they can market to people, and then rather than actually work together and think about what could be unified, they forget the waste and planned obsolescence, the constant repetition of production that's destroying the planet.
Right.
If you actually had, instead of this long-term process of innovation through competition, you actually had a network system where people just thought about what they wanted to do, what the public actually had interest for. Democratizing the economy is effectively what I'm talking about.
Right.
Participatory economics is the final stage of this long arc of our battle with ourselves to figure out why we continue to be at war with ourselves.
Right.
And I think once we have that, and I think other people have talked about this too, not to keep rambling, but Martin Luther King, before he died, talked explicitly about an economic bill of rights in the United States.
Right.
And he promoted at that time, which was the most advanced thing and completely radical for the time, universal basic income, which is now being talked about, tested.
Again, it's coming back. Yeah.
It is.
Hawaii's starting to lay the groundwork, I just read.
Are they really?
Yeah, just within the last few days.
There's a caveat to that, which we can talk about. I advocate it. I think it's a great idea as a step. But there's something to be recognized for it. There's a problem with it in a society that's driven by debt and scarcity, where, especially now with automation, there are not enough jobs. Their jobs are slowly inching out. We know this.
Right.
And what has to happen is what happened in the 70s. In the 70s, there was massive credit expansion in the West because people needed money, and the kind of surplus that was generated by industry was so much that the corporations had to keep selling. So now they just started to employ credit expansion, so people would keep buying and consuming. Fighting the communists by consuming more. There's this whole amazing history I detail in the book about how we were turned into a consumer culture. Point being is that you have to get money in the pockets of people to support the economy.
Right.
And universal basic income is actually kind of an elitist solution, even though it will help, it will improve public health. But today, there's a reason why you see the intuition of the Zuckerbergs and so on start to say, universal basic, or Elon Musk, universal basic income is a great idea because they know in the subconscious level, I don't know, this isn't conspiratorial, they just know because of the work that they're in, that people have to get money in this new automated society.
Right.
And that money, because of the nature of structural classism, I call it, will still come out of nothing and filter right back up to the elite.
Right.
And right now, we have 8 people with more money than the bottom 50%.
Right.
And that's only going to get worse.
Right. So my fundamental question about these things, this economic inequality that's obviously growing, it's worse than it's been in since the 1920s, I guess, and maybe even worse than then at this point. I was working on this book, and I was looking at the economics, and you were talking about studies of wellness and happiness and contentment with life and all that sort of thing. And I came upon all this research literature showing that there is no correlation above about $70,000 a year between wealth and life satisfaction. So that led me to this giant conundrum where I sort of looked at economy as, I used to get together with my buddies and play poker every Sunday night, right? And it's like I show up with $40, I leave with 20. That means somebody else is going home with 20 more, or as a group, they're leaving with 20 more than they came with. But if you look at economy the way I just described it, and you say, well, wait a minute, even the rich are not benefiting. So those 8 people who control more than 50% of the total wealth of the country, they're miserable motherfuckers. Yeah. They're off in their yacht. They're lonely. They're suspicious of their friends. Yeah. They're probably addicted to all sorts of drugs. They're miserable fucking losers. So if they're losing, then we're not playing poker in someone's house where my loss is your gain. We're playing poker in a casino where we all lose.
Right.
So who's the house? What do you think about that? Who is the house? Who's benefiting from all this?
You mean in terms of happiness? You mean because obviously, I mean, the money is going to these people.
The money, but see, I think I look at it on a meta level.
Okay.
I think that, and you've studied this far more than I, so this is just, I'm not, I don't want to argue with you. I just want to introduce this as a topic, because I've got this sense that, you said we're at war with ourselves. That was a phrase you used a minute ago. And certainly, that's a powerful way of looking at it. And clearly there are conflicts within the human psyche and within human nature and all that.
But in society too.
And it's
looking at holistic society.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I'm coming to this sense that we're at war with, and this is going to sound crazy. It's like one step from lizard people, but essentially we are embedded within organisms that, just like bacteria is embedded within us.
Okay.
Life is a congregation of other life.
Sure.
If you look at any sort of level of complexity on the scale of life, each higher level is composed of lower levels that all come together and form a system. And I know you're into systems thinking,
sure.
and you're very conscious of this stuff. So my feeling is when I started looking at this, I was like, okay, wait a minute. Everything congregates and becomes something else. So what have we become? What are we? What life form are we embedded within? And my answer was institutions.
Yep.
Religions, corporations, governments. And they are functioning on a level kind of like the gods on Mount Olympus, in ancient Greece, where they've got their dramas and their conflicts and things, and we get swept around without really even knowing what the fuck is happening.
Oh, sure.
So I kind of look at these very wealthy people as victims just like the rest of us.
I agree, absolutely. I don't demonize any of the folks. I don't demonize really anybody. I mean, we can argue people's, moral compass on a couple different levels, but we're all victims on some level of the culture and the world we've been brought into. And you're absolutely right regarding the happiness issue. I'll come back to that structuralism you just mentioned too. And the second chapter of the book, I describe all the research about how people that gain lots of wealth, and it's very well researched, that automatically lose empathy the higher they go up, and become more miserable and become more addiction prone because money becomes an addiction, and they become more, well, I hate to be cliche here in the modern world, but we have the icon of the Trump presidency, and all the values that clearly he puts forward, winning, a complete lack of empathy, and rewardingly so. Like he appreciates that he doesn't care, and that kind of embodies, I think, the psychology, the social psychology that we have as not only a culture, but definitely pollutes the wealthy more than anybody else, which is really troubling because it's obviously the wealthy that have the lobbying power. It's obviously the wealthy that have been in control of government, not just in this modern period, but throughout history, going all the way back to monarchs, those that have the most resources, and are by nature the most indifferent. Nature meaning there's something about this arc. The more power and money you have, specifically money leading. Yeah. So we're kind of screwed in that sense because if we rely on our
objective. Sorry to interrupt
you,
but you're not just spouting some bullshit here. There are studies showing that the more wealth someone has, the less able they are to perceive pain in someone else's face.
Did you see that study? Exactly. Yeah, that's precise. No, it's in the book too. I talk about a lot of those studies with that conclusion that we're stuck in a power system that's fundamentally indifferent by this kind of determinism that's happened. You could speculate on the deeper causes of that as
well, that's where I'm trying to go. The determinism that you're referring to is because we're so accustomed to thinking of it. I know you're involved in the Occupy movement and a big supporter of this, and we're so accustomed to thinking the 1% and versus the 99%.
Sure.
And my feeling is like it's 100% against this system, whether we call it corporations or we call it institutions, or we call it the sort of the mega organism or whatever it is, whose agenda is against ours. And the difference between the 1% are like I forget the name in the prison camps, the Jews who controlled the other Jews.
Okay.
So they got a little extra bread, a little extra soup, but they were the ones who turned in, and like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like they've sold their souls for a little extra soup at the end of the day.
Right.
But they're still in the fucking camp with the rest of
Well,
us.
the other parallel to that is American slavery and the separation. And this is talked about at great length through historians. Actually, Gandhi and Martin Luther King talked about it a great deal. That's where I read about it. I didn't even really. No one taught me this when I was in high school regarding American slavery. White poverty was just as bad, especially right after the Civil War.
Right.
And the political establishment said, well, you know what? If the poor whites and the poor blacks ever get together, well, we have a serious problem on our hand.
Right.
So the use, basically the whites were given superiority in their Christian white status. They identified with the masters and the political establishment. And they're the ones that were basically, they could, and then by some legislation, they could bully slaves or even former slaves, all that history of legal racism. Yeah. And so that's a similar parallel where you divide and conquer ultimately. Because it's really, ultimately, all of that in history, not to change the subject, was an issue of class war.
Right.
I mean, people forget that all of the slavery was just about profit. I mean, even the slaves that were sold from Africa, I mean, white settlers didn't just go steal Africans. They were being sold by kings. Sure. Yeah. And then, so anyway, so
in
that's
exchange for sugar and rum.
Right. Yeah. And going back to your structural issue, the book opens with the concept of structuralism, which is put forward by Johann Galtung and Gandhi, and is a brilliant notion. It's a little bit antagonistic towards rationalism because it argues that people are not really rational. They are defined by the structures they inhabit or are born into. It seems like common sense to us, but I think a lot of people, especially in the moral climate, the legal system, everyone thinks everyone's just a perfectly rational being. The economic system certainly believes that.
Economic man is a fucking joke.
Yeah,
but it's the foundation of economics.
Right, and that hence its myopic unfoldings.
Yeah.
And so with that structuralism, with the institutions you mentioned, and ultimately the social system, foundationally oriented with economics, you call it capitalism, market economics, it's a scarcity-driven social order. That's I think we can get rid of most of those terms. And there's been, ever since the Neolithic Revolution, 10, 12,000 years ago, there's been a geographical determinism that defined the way people needed to be. So you had settled agrarian societies, some were in more opportune areas with better fertile land and so on, some were not. So you had to have specialization of labor. You had eventually that leads to property because you want to protect it because your labor translates, the old labor theories and so on.
And the land and the animals.
Exactly. And you build out power, system, war. You build out this. So I think what we've been on is a natural trajectory. Some have argued that the Neolithic Revolution was kind of a mistake on our part.
Who would argue such a thing?
And it's a good thing to think about.
Yeah.
So we've now reached a point where this whole Malthusian scarcity-driven world, since the Industrial Revolution, we have this new potential. It's new potential for humanity to stop war with itself, to stop feeling we have to exploit and enslave each other, like what we effectively do in the corporate system, which effectively what we do in even the entrepreneurial system. People don't realize that they're constantly in this war with each other, and they, I've had debates with libertarians, and it's amazing the kind of backwards thinking where up is down and left is right, where they think that the act of trade is not actually dominant strategizing. It's some kind of mutual exchange of. It's a very, very abstract notion that is put forward in these theories of free market. And the truth is that when you have a trade dominant, scarcity-based society, you automatically lead to everything that we've seen today, including the American empire.
Yeah.
And it spirals out like that. And the question is, how do we start to harness the new technology, the new capacity, I should say, we have to create an abundance, to create a strategic abundance, not a utopian abundance, to sidestep the materialism and vanity, to sidestep the reward of status that has been so neurotically ingrained, again, going back to the Trump idea and, the trophy wife and all these accepted misogynistic ideas, all these accepted just...
Trophy wife who hates your fucking guts.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
sure.
My God.
I'm sure she could handle him when he was just, a dickhead businessman. Now he's the president and she has to be seen all the time. So, and that's the ultimate, where I argue towards the end is that there are a number of transitions, and we could talk about that more so, that can happen that are based on current trends that are not over-idealized, that if the public was to get behind it, you have to have a movement to do this, because the neuroses of power isn't just going to turn. It's going to keep drilling the earth into the ground, and it's going to keep basically thriving on the destruction of other peoples, because that's kind of the way the scarcity-based trade strategizing dominance patterns ultimately. There's a guy, Tim Ingold. Are you familiar with him? He's an anthropologist. He did a great little quote. It just stunned me when I read it. Not a quote, but he talked about the difference between the hunter-gatherer societies and modern agrarian trading societies. And the difference, and it's such a profound notion, is that first, the hunter-gatherer society had a gift-giving sentiment. When the early civilizations were met, people talk about this, like Peter Faber or Margaret Mead, Westerns would try to exchange,
Right.
and they would be offended by that.
Yeah.
And now we have, instead of gift-giving and harmony and what was effectively a voluntary type of relationship,
Right.
trade strategizing dominance,
Right.
the expectation of reciprocation.
Right.
And it might seem like a very trivial thing to a lot of people, but that's a powerful, profound
It's a huge
underpinning.
difference. Yeah. I was quoting from Columbus's journals, his first journey.
Yeah.
He was actually, in his journals, they were written as letters to the king and queen, and so if a ship was going back, he'd send it back to them to recount what he had seen and all this. And it's really quite stunning. You might have read this, actually. I think Howard Zinn quotes from it in The People's History of the USA.
It's been a long time, but okay.
Yeah, it's a great book. And anyone listening to this who hasn't read that, it's a great place to start.
Definitely.
Anyway, he talks about his first meeting on Hispaniola with the Taino, or the people there, and he talks about how beautiful they are, physically beautiful and kind, and if you express admiration for anything, they just give it to you with no expectations, and he says they're surely the most wonderful people on the planet. They're the most wonderful people in the world. And then the next sentence is, with 50 men we could enslave them all.
Right. I remember that now, yeah. God.
What the fuck, dude?
He said something like,
you found paradise,
Yeah.
and the first thing you're thinking is, we can enslave these wonderful people instead of join them.
Yeah.
They have a better life than you
So
do.
be inspired by them, yeah.
They're the embodiment of Christ, the actual Christ, and instead they're saying, well, no.
Christian values.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, crazy. Anyway.
Yeah, that's horrible. I remember that. I think he also made a comment about, we tried to show them a sword and they didn't know
cut
what
their
it was.
hands on it.
They didn't know what it was.
And we all laughed. Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. I mean, that's this book I'm working on, A Civilized to Death, it's called, and a lot of it is, it's very parallel to a lot of the work you're doing. As I said earlier, it's questioning. First of all, it's questioning the neo-Hobbesian narrative that life before the state was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Sure.
That's wrong on every count.
Absolutely.
Right? Then it's questioning the notion that civilization is itself a great gift to humanity. Like, let's look at that. Like, what has it actually given us?
In the sense of modern civilization, the way it currently functions, yes.
I mean, forget about feudalism. Jesus Christ. But, like, where we are now, even you and me, even the people at the top of the heap and, the most wealthy parts of the world with the most freedom and the most technological adaptations and all this, how does our quality of life compare to that of a typical hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago in terms of, how's our sex life? How are our friendships and sense of community?
Right.
How's our physical health, our dental health, our cardiovascular health?
Sure.
What's our relationship like with children, and what's our spiritual life like? How fearful are we of death? I mean, pick your fucking matrix.
Yeah.
And this idea that civilization has been this incredible gift to humanity just falls apart.
It does.
But as you said earlier, it's so hard to get people to see that because they're born into this structural, either brains, or it's kind of like, those things, those ice cube, you can get those weird ice cube shapes where you can make like a popsicle that looks like a lizard or something.
Yep.
That's like our brains. They go into a mold and they come out.
There's so much great educational value in that early history, and sadly, most people really aren't even aware of part of our time.
Well, and
they
that's
really
no
do.
fucking accident.
Well, of course,
right?
Of course.
No, a society wants to replicate itself like any living thing, so it promotes the information that makes it look good.
Exactly.
Which is not fucking science; it's propaganda.
Yeah, the climate of opinion, I think Carl Becker called it. People only reference and annotate in history what they identify with,
right?
And suddenly becomes shifted.
So your background's in economics? So you were working on Wall Street or something?
No, I did actually, but my background is self-taught. Basically, I went to school as a classical percussionist and realized after going into enormous amounts of debt in New York City that wasn't where I wanted to go.
You're at the new school, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I decided that I didn't want to be a classical percussionist in an orchestral setting because that's sort of the corporate context.
Were you like the guy in the back with the kettle drum?
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. But I was more soloistic in my interests. I decided I'd just take it on as a hobby and do something else. And at that point in time, all of my friends that were in the arts ended up in advertising, which is just a natural gravitation. Of course, a monstrous industry in New York. That was where I first started to see the enormous amounts of wealth that people have. It was
monstrous in both senses of the word.
Yeah.
Huge and horrible.
Exactly. Real estate advertising. So these are people that would buy penthouse apartments in Central Park West and pay $30,000 a month in whatever it's called, your maintenance fee. Just exceptional. Like we made movies basically for the wealthy to look at, to idealize themselves.
Right.
Speaking of the vein.
Right.
So I got sick of that. Even in my background, I still generally didn't like advertising. I grew up with like George Carlin and Bill Hicks, and read a lot of extraneous materials, more fringe. That was my world. That was.
Where'd you grow up?
North Carolina.
And were your parents hippies, or why did you have
kind of
George Carlin in
kind of? Oh yeah, they were fans. Absolutely.
That's great.
Definitely. And so at that point, I was like, I hate this corporate hierarchy. I don't like this. I certainly don't like the hours, the insanity. The advertising industry is just so much money's into it, and the hours are terrible, and the people are crazy. It's just a unique phenomenon in and of itself. So I was like, I got to get out of this. I don't know what else to do. These are my skill sets as an artist. You end up there. But Wall Street, I said, well, this is the only occupation. I didn't give a damn what it meant. So I was like, this is the only occupation I know of that doesn't have a client or a boss. So I gravitated to this. I took mentorships with the savings I had built up from advertising. And these guys were not on Wall Street, but they were private traders. And they worked, for private accounts. Some of them worked in the business community.
So
I studied.
How old are you?
I was about 20. I was about 23 when I started doing that.
Yeah, young.
Yeah.
So is that where you got into filmmaking and the advertising?
Well, I get to that in a second. I actually never intended to be a filmmaker at all. I did do editing and stuff like that and animation. It was more graphic stuff.
Right.
But we did do composite stuff, green screen stuff, which I still do.
And this is what, the 90s?
Yeah, this is about about 2000.
2000.
Right. Yeah, 2001, 2002 is when I started to inch out of that into Wall Street. And then for the next 5 years, I did half work in advertising part-time and then traded for my own account. So I did extremely short-term trading.
Day trading?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And in that world, because I was in circles of people that were very wealthy that did this, in these mentorships, it's a very, very unique field. I won't go into what it takes to be a pattern trader, but a very unique analysis. The people I worked around were not cutthroat, horrible people. They wanted out just like I did. They just didn't want to deal with the corporate hierarchy. So there's not to say that a lot of people in Wall Street and trading are necessarily good folks. They still have that psychology of gain and abstraction. It's I call it drone warfare economics now. It's like at least on Main Street, you kind of can
You're not
see
sticking anyone. Yeah.
You can see the humanity, but not in Wall Street.
Right.
That's why it has the reputation that it does, and rightfully so, and should be abolished as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, you don't see the grandparents whose account you're emptying with your bullshit.
Exactly. Or the currency that you're shorting from some country where you're throwing people into poverty.
Right.
So I did that, and then I realized towards about 2006, after I made this first production called Zeitgeist, which was not actually a film, it was a performance piece I did as a catharsis. I realized at that point in time, this convergence of things happened. And by the way, I should step back. That's where I learned about economics. So I studied human psychology, and I studied pattern behavior and all the history of effectively macroeconomics, because that's what you look at when you start to trade in the micro realm. So that's the introduction.
Flesh that out a little.
Okay.
I'm really interested in this stuff.
Well, it's specific to pattern trading, where you have different synergetic forces that create probabilities. So if you have, for example, a certain industry that broadly has a certain trend, like a sector, like in technology, and it's pattern trading, so using visual cues. You chart it. Have you ever seen a stock chart?
Yeah.
There's basically, just like in human nature, just like in human culture and there are patterns that exist that we do.
Right.
And they're represented actually quite cleanly on charts of mass human behavior, especially with stocks or commodities that have a lot of human activity.
So you're looking at like purchasing trends or
pretty much.
certain
Buying and
technologies
selling.
Moving in a certain direction.
Well, on the macro level, you have sector information. Right. So what is this entire sector doing? All the conglomerate companies together, because they
How many cars are being sold?
Well, you see it in price patterns collectively, mathematically redefined as this trend.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And then you start to go smaller and smaller and smaller. And long story short, it's kind of hard to explain without showing it to you visually.
Right.
You can create you create a higher probability of assuming a stock is going to move in a certain direction by watching the macro influences, and you start to navigate lower and lower and lower. I'm trying to think of a parallel. I can't think of a parallel that would be easy to relate to. But at the end of the day, what these traders do is they see a certain probabilistic pattern happening in multiple time frames across multiple sectors or multiple layers within a sector. Again, it's hard for me to explain without showing it to you. And then at a certain point, the probabilities are in their favor based on their analysis, and they buy or sell.
And are you buying on margin, or are you just buying the stock?
I did buy on margins. I didn't have much in my account to make it worthwhile. I mean, a good trader maybe will make maybe if they're good, maybe like 10%. And that's like, you can get a 10%, 12% a year. That's where hedge fund managers, make eventually millions a year.
Right, yeah.
Because they have so much money. But if you make that on a $100,000 account, you can't really live off of it. And that's with margin, you have a $25,000 account. So anyway, I didn't make enough to do that because I never had the base to really do it. And I kind of just faded out of it. And it was at that point in time, though, I came to the realization that, what am I doing? I've worked in the two worst industries probably on the planet, advertising and Wall Street. I just had this amazing epiphany. And apart from making this film that eventually became a film called Zeitgeist, which some love it, some hate it, it was really an expression of the time as far as I was concerned. I eventually made 2 sequels to kind of clarify my position and then re-target the audience that had followed the first one into new focuses, specifically economics, which is where I am today. And of course, the Zeitgeist movement was born out of that, which has been around for 9-10 years, which is an attempt to galvanize the world, to whatever feeble attempt it could be. We still have about 140 chapters across 60 countries. And that's the trajectory of it. But, going back to your question about economics, it was all that trading stuff and the advertising stuff. Because if it wasn't for the advertising, I wouldn't have really seen
You were
just
behind
how
enemy
absurd.
lines
Oh,
there.
totally.
Yeah.
Oh, you wouldn't believe some of the wealth. I think if the public really experienced the wealth that the upper 10% has, they would be so stunned. Like, I don't even think it's in the public consciousness.
Yeah.
They don't even know how these people live. They just know the statistics. They don't know what it feels like to fly in a private jet every other day going around, like stuff like that.
No lines. Just
No
walk
lines.
right in. Yeah.
It's straight out of.
Although but again, I mean, I get back. I take your point, and I think you're right, especially in terms of people who can't afford to buy medicine for their kids or feed their kids or whatever. I mean, that's incredible, but still, even at that very top level, I have a friend who lives on a yacht. It's one of those like mega yachts, literally a mega yacht,
Sure.
Russian oligarch kind of thing. No helicopter, but he's like one step below the helicopter.
Okay.
He's got the sauna and the jacuzzi on the top deck and the whole thing, right? And he made his money on wind farming. So
Interesting.
it's kind of not evil, I guess, So
My argument: if someone has $1 billion, no matter how they achieved it, they should feel pretty bad about themselves.
well, there is that, yeah.
I think, and there's a relativity to that, obviously. I mean, where do you draw the line? And
Yeah,
obviously, the first world compared to the third world, you could argue the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Someone lives in a house like this, say, "Whoa, how dare you live in this house where we have people living on the street?" But there does come a line, I think, that becomes relatively obvious after a certain point where the elitism is so severe, where the options are so severe, and when you look at and compare to how much destitution there is, you can't justify it anymore. And I think the billionaire class really, it is a mental illness.
Yeah, it's definitely. Anyway, without getting into to that too much, the point I was going to make is, I've spent some time on the yacht with him, and the truth is that, he's got a chef on the yacht who cooks, but you know where they get their food?
Where?
Costco. Yeah. So I go in the morning to grab something, and I go into the freezer, and it's all whatever the Costco brand is, like for Kirkland or something.
Wow.
It's all Costco stuff. So it's like, all right, it's a yacht. You're a millionaire. You've got Egyptian cotton or whatever. But at the end of the day, you're still wiping your ass with Costco toilet paper, and you're eating Costco. But not that there's anything wrong with Costco. My whole point is you're still just a fucking person.
Exactly.
Exactly. And that gets back to my earlier point about how all that wealth, it's like I have a line in the book, and it'll probably offend some people, where I say a watch tells the time, a Rolex tells the world you're insecure. You know, it's
That's
like
good.
a watch is a nice thing to have. You don't need a fucking Rolex.
I can't even imagine having a mansion where you have to deal with taking care of something so severe. Even a yacht to me sounds
Yeah.
like too much. And then you have to employ all these people.
Yeah.
Like, to me, utopia, if I want to use that word, is not having any property.
Right.
Is to have the
What's
freedom.
fucking hunter gatherers?
Sure, exactly.
Everything you need is
Absolutely.
just around you.
And I think there's a minimalistic culture. They've done research on millennials these days, and they're gravitating more towards a socialistic view,
Right.
statistically. And they also have a deep minimalism. Like many of them don't want. They're reverting back to not smartphones. They
Van
want
life.
a simple.
That's why I got that van. That's
Yeah.
a big thing.
Totally.
Like young people are like, fuck it, I'll live in my van.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
And I think that's a much healthier place to be. And it reverses, and I talk about that in the book too. It reverses that neuroses that's been generated by status and property and
Right.
and how they're associated.
So do you think we're at a unique historical moment where people are questioning this in ways they never have before, or is that just you and me in our little bubble
Yeah,
who
that's a
see
good
it
question.
that way?
With the internet and communication, people and the way that systems work, information is now so tailored in pockets where if you're a Republican, alt-right, Trump supporter, you can pretty much just submerge yourself in only the information that you agree with.
Right.
Whether you search for it, whether the advertising algorithms are for it, whether your social media is collected for it.
Right.
And the other side, you can have pro Bernie Sanders, whatever,
Yeah.
and then that world seems like it's the only world that exists too. Like in my world, at least in terms of my digital reality, which unfortunately starts to define our absolute reality these days, which is a little bit terrifying in and of itself. But I don't see any of the right wing folks in my world, except for those that troll me. That's very
But
few.
you see Trump,
Of
right?
course,
And
no, I know.
You see
But
what he's doing.
Oh, absolutely. But my point is that I think that there's extremity on both sides, and there's a term by Franco Berardi. He's an Italian theorist, and he calls it semiocapitalism, or symbolic capitalism. It's the merger of capitalist values and ideals and what's culminated through it, and technology and virtual reality. And I think this expresses with the rise of Trump as a reality TV star,
Right.
and the way people really aren't able to consciously differentiate between reality and virtual entertainment anymore.
Right.
It's a brilliant and deep and profound notion where people are looking at the world through the lens of a TV show, and it's subconsciously inhibiting their thoughts. They don't have a sense of realism anymore. They have a sense of abstraction. They get off on even if it does, even in their own what pertains to them becomes lost. They see things as a separate structure, as a separate kind of form of I can't verbalize this well. They see things as a separate symbology, a show, and this has really permeated people in the 21st century with the advent of the internet, with the use of smartphones, with the fact that our reality is starting to merge with this kind of virtual news.
Yeah. And they see their own lives as show as well.
Exactly.
Look at me on Instagram.
Exactly. My God, the Instagram and the social media phenomenon, in the sense of how people portray themselves, is so revealing.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how people look back at the society from the future. Like, what the hell are these people doing? Assuming we made it to a more advanced state, the indulgence, the narcissism, the complete ADD, the just
Total waste of time.
hideous. Oh my God. So.
Yeah.
And that's the semio-capitalism. That's this. It's not what you really are. It's what people perceive you as, and your status is represented in the external.
Right.
And it plays into, not to shift the subject too much, but it plays into that limbic system response, our innate need to have social inclusion, because we are in many ways defined by the way we relate.
Right.
That's why I don't walk around in a Victorian gown or something, because
Is that the only reason? Really? Is that what you'd really like to be wearing right now? In a powdered wig?
that'd be awesome. Even though they still do that a little bit in Britain.
They still take themselves so fucking seriously too with those powdered wigs.
Unbelievable.
I mean, they may as well be wearing like clown shoes or something. It's really funny.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, I love it. I often counsel, like for some reason, young people are writing to me asking for life advice,
Yeah.
which is,
That's good.
like asking the Pope for sex advice. But one of the things I counsel young people to do is intentionally become ridiculous. Like young men should shave their heads.
Yeah.
I think every man should shave his head in his early 20s. And in the military they do, of course.
Right.
But I think everyone should do it. because then when you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, and you start losing hair, you won't sweat it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I've seen myself bald. I got used to it. People still talk to me. I still had friends. People, I still had lovers, whatever. Like, deal with it. Face it.
Yeah.
Get through it, and then leave it behind. Or walk down the street wearing a ridiculous fucking goofy clothing and just like watch people laugh at you.
Very healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, and then go home and be like, oh, people laughed at me today and nothing changed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important. I forget what that has to do with.
It traps.
Oh, the powdered wigs.
Yeah. Well, it traps people because their identity is now so locked in, especially in the virtual realm, because when something's on the internet, it never really goes away. So people are terrified to move against the grain. I criticize the scientific and academic community quite a bit these days because I don't understand how the intelligentsia of our world hasn't come to the same conclusions regarding the influence of and destructive nature of our social system. At a minimum, the ecological reality of what we're doing should be apparent to all. You can't have a system based on consumption and turnover where jobs are a outcome of demand, and demand is an outcome of people consuming, and more the better.
Right.
Especially in a high productive society we have now after the Industrial Revolution. People are making so much and with more with less. You're familiar with Jeremy Rifkin?
Yeah.
So he's did a great job in he calls it zero marginal cost. And you look at this capacity for us to create more and more with less and less, and what it's led to due to consumer culture is extremely cheap things that break, so people will buy more of them.
Right.
You go back and look at the technology.
And fewer jobs because of robotics. And all that, yeah.
And I mean that's a sideline, but back to the ecological issues. No way you could consider this to be sustainable.
Yeah.
It is the root of the ecological.
It's actually. I mean, you mentioned Malthus earlier,
right?
And for people who aren't familiar with Thomas Malthus, he argued famously that the population grows exponentially, whereas the food supply can only grow arithmetically.
Right.
So you can have 5 acres and turn it into 10 acres, but in the meantime, you've had 500,000 people who have become 250,000 people because we reproduce. I write about him in Sex at Dawn, and then also in this. He was totally wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it made sense in the abstract, but he had assumed that human population had always grown at that rate. He was basing it on the population growth of European settlers in North America.
Right.
Essentially empty, because they were killing the Indians and the disease was wiping them out.
Right.
Environment. And when you look at actual hunter-gatherer population, it remained virtually steady for hundreds of thousands of years until the Neolithic Revolution,
right,
when it started going nuts.
Right.
So this idea of growth, population growth being an inevitable aspect of human society is totally wrong.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Well, before we get into that, okay. There was something you said earlier that I wanted to explore a little bit, if you're willing. Mm-hmm. That moment when you said you had an epiphany, mm-hmm. and you're like, what the fuck am I doing? Advertising, investment. Yeah. What am I doing? What was that moment? What triggered it? How old were you? What was going on in your life? Because I think a lot of people never have that moment.
I was about 27, and it coincided with, again, that first film that I did, a very controversial performance piece. I was doing all this, and I came home late at night, and in the midst of these 2 jobs, I worked on this production. And it was kind of came out of me subconsciously. It wasn't until after it got really big that I realized the merit of the pursuit. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's as though the realization didn't come from me, it came from the power of the reaction.
The fact that it resonated so deeply.
Because I was pretty pessimistic. I had the same kind of apathy that I think a lot of people, combined with the narcissism of youth that's inherent, where I see the problems of the world, I see this, but what am I supposed to do about it?
Right.
I got to concern myself with my survival,
right,
and so on and so forth. And it just struck, I had an empathic realization, and it opened it up, and I realized that there has to be something deeper than just the self-interest pursuit. So by the time
so there are no drugs involved or mental breakdowns, or auto accidents.
No, nothing that dramatic.
Death of a close friend.
I mean, when my first film hit, as again, it wasn't a film. I was never intended to be a filmmaker. It caused such a massive reaction. I was attacked by amazing press, New York Times, Skeptic Society, because I talked about religion and they didn't like how I did it, even though it was in line with a lot of. I got the enormous amount of trolling and hate sites. I've spent at least $20,000 in lawsuits pulling websites down because they were completely propagandized lunacy, doxing my parents' address and all this stuff. I mean, the contrast of all of that between the hate and then the support, like enormous amounts of support that people came in. Emails. I still have like a great majority of them. The email account I had set up on the website, you could see an email come in roughly every minute for at least 7 months.
Wow.
And it was lunacy. I'm not exaggerating.
How many people have seen the film at this point?
Before Google pulled the counter on it, when it shifted, because this is a time when YouTube didn't exist. At least it didn't have full length videos. This is Google Video, the very first kind of full, video site that had full feature length films. It was about 50 million before they pulled that, and that was in about 9 months of time. And then they got really nervous about all these weird videos that were up at the top of their ranking system. So they pulled it and they dropped it. It's like they reset everything. And then it got moved. As of right now, I peg the 3 films at about 250 million people, but it's probably more than that because it's been translated into at least 60 languages. And it has a life of its own since it was released on the internet. And I didn't actually restrict it in copyright, at least initially. I have certain restrictions now because of things have changed, especially with people taking samples of it and making money off of it in other ways. But the expansion of it, like I'll go to countries that I've never really thought about the influence of that film, especially after a decade, and there's just this enormous number of people that were influenced by it that I never would have expected. So I really don't know.
That's a wild experience.
It really was, and I think that was really the revelation. It's like, well, I see I have a role now. And sometimes I think it takes that kind of external pressure to get people to snap out, make them feel a sense of purpose and to reinforce what they've intuitively felt anyway.
Right. So you made your statement before you were any sort of a spokesman.
Pretty much. I would have gone right back to my bizarre world after that production if it wasn't for the impact that it had.
And were you married or a relationship or anything?
I had girlfriends. Yeah. But no, nothing like that.
But you didn't have like a partner who was like.
Not really. No. Not at that exact point in time.
Reflecting it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, you're really lucky that happened. So many people get into these worlds where it's like, yeah, this isn't really my world, but what else am I going to do? And it's too late to change. And next thing you know, life's gone by and you're a fucking advertising executive.
Yeah, right. Well, I could argue that I'm still out of water on it. It's not natural to me. I'm very introspective as an introvert. So public speaking has taken a lot for me to go around and give talks. And
you do it a lot, though, right? You're doing a lot of podcasts and TV
right
shows.
Now with the book, I'm trying my best, to give it some oomph. So I have to, promote it, and I really believe it. It took a lot of work, but even before that, I'd be invited to places to even talk about the films, and it was just very difficult. Yeah, it wasn't natural at all.
Well, you're good at it.
I hope so.
You're very articulate.
I hope I've gotten better.
Yeah. The films, you edit the films?
Yeah, I did everything.
You did everything?
Yeah, even the music.
Really well done.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like anything you create. You look at it 10 years later, you're like, you don't want to. But I'm in production now with another trilogy. It's a live action one that takes this stuff to
I just watched the trailer this morning.
Okay.
What's it called?
Inner Reflections.
Inner Reflections. It's really well done.
Oh, thank you.
The trailer's fucking terrifying. It's got sort of a Matrix-y vibe to it, and
it's a mixed genre piece, so the trailer's a little misleading.
It starts. It feels like a documentary at first, and then suddenly there's a character introduced. Yep. It's sort of a
story.
The sort of terrorist hacker.
I'm building
John
on
Taylor, I think.
Right, I'm building on memes of Anonymous and WikiLeaks.
Anonymous, yeah.
And I anticipate in the future, and this is one of the trajectories that we should all be worried about. Well, 2 of them: diversity of the ecological decline, climate change, and so on. Even if climate change wasn't the focus, there's so many other problems in hand that need to be rectified. I mean, we'll have more plastic in the ocean by 2050 than fish. Right?
Yeah.
But then there's the social destabilization factor. What's going to happen when people that in their basement have nanotechnology capacities? 'Cause that's the more with less phenomenon. Going back to Jeremy Rifkin,
Right.
Things are just going to get smaller and more powerful.
Right.
And if you have a society that's increasingly angry, you have pockets of poverty, which by probability, on a certain level, you will have statistically people that go off the deep end.
Yeah.
Whether we can argue moral issue of that, as people like to do with terrorism and so on.
Go off the deep end. You're saying mentally, or you're talking?
Well, I mean, where they don't care anymore, where they're willing to harm. Exactly, they're willing to harm the world.
Yeah.
And so,
we already have those people. We do millions of
absolutely.
Those people.
But what's going to happen when the technology is at their fingertips to do destruction, have capacities of destruction that we've never had before?
Right.
So that's a race against time.
Suitcase nukes.
Even beyond that, though.
Yeah.
That's been a threat for a long time.
Bioterror.
Right.
Yeah.
What we see now is actually quite modest. In fact, I'm really quite surprised we haven't seen more extremity on a level of high technology. Yeah. So the film builds on a positive version of that, where in the future, and I think there's some merit to this, not just in the fictional reality of the film, but where there's a hacktivist group for good, and they've become so powerful. They've developed the ability to actually fight against the establishment, the empires, and the Pentagons, and so on, the preservers of the status quo. And they've become so powerful with their technology, they're actually able to change the world as an opposition force.
Yeah.
And I like that idea. Not to say I advocate that, but I think it gives people perspective, because I really don't believe the revolutions of the future will happen from a political establishment as it exists. I think it will happen from a grassroots campaign of people that finally realize the potentials, as I talk about in the last chapter of the book, and through whatever mechanisms required, I'm not sure what that will be, but it won't be through referendums.
Yeah.
They will start to recreate society, and those that wish to join them, well, then that starts the new world and the new phenomenon.
Yeah.
I hope that something like that occurs, because I really, as I said before, don't believe that the political establishment has it in it. And even if you get elected into those positions, even if Bernie Sanders, for example, was elected, there's such a massive pushback against what the logic of the system is, that you're so deeply limited. At a minimum, he would have helped some of the social public health stuff, but at complete failure of anything that deals with the ecological decline.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of feel with politics, the Frank Zappa quote, politics is the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex.
That's good.
I just feel like, it's like we're in a self-driving bus arguing at who gets to sit in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
It's headed over the cliff. I try to be optimistic for my own mental health, but if I had to, if I were a day trader and I had to, calculate what I think the odds are.
So you think it's improbable, and there's a certain level of me that thinks that too.
Well, we'd have to define what it is in this case, but
a sustainable, socially just world.
I don't think that's improbable, but I think it's improbable that we will get there by making good decisions. I think we'll get there by having, the shit is already hitting the fan, and we'll come out on the other side of it, hopefully, having learned from the global collapse and whatever. I think we're going to go through a serious crisis. There's a great essay published a few years ago in Eon magazine online. I'm very interested in how evolutionary theory has been co-opted by capitalism to justify, and the neo-Hobbesian worldview is at the heart of both of those. And Malthus, of course. Malthus was the world's first economist.
Was.
Yeah. So, there you go.
British East India Company.
Yeah.
Which is spooky enough, considering that was the arm of colonialism.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting convergence.
So you can see how his logic would easily justify the colonial, expression.
And it also justified the incredible economic disparities. Yep. And that, I argue, that's the power of the argument. The argument itself falls apart the minute you start looking at data, but the sort of seeming mathematical inevitability of it, combined with its great utility in justifying the economic disparity, so that once you grasp the argument, you can say, well then the poor will always be with us. It doesn't make sense if we help these people, they're just gonna reproduce, and then we'll have the same problem we had before. So you're not actually being compassionate by helping poor people. You should they're always going to be there.
Yeah, there's that great Malthus quote where he I don't know if you've read that. I can't state it verbatim, but he actually goes the reverse. It's like we should push the poor near the swamps, and he berates the well-meaning men, but ignorant men that try to help reduce this problem.
You know who the well-meaning but ignorant man was that he had in mind? His father.
Really?
Yeah, there's a very deep sort of Oedipal thing going on.
Really?
Because his father was good friends with Goodwin, I think his name was, who was an extreme progressive.
I remember Goodwin, yeah. He was socialist, more or less.
Yeah. And he argued that at that point, and we're talking, early 1800s, I believe, he used to come over to the house, and Malthus's father and Goodwin would sit at the table and debate, and young Thomas would sit there and join in. And so, like a lot of young people, he defined himself against his father and against his father's ideas.
Interesting.
But Goodwin was arguing for equal rights for women. This is like 1812
I remember reading his work a long time ago.
Yeah. His daughter was the author of Frankenstein.
Oh, really?
Mary Shelley.
Mary Shelley.
Yeah. And he was also arguing for redistribution of wealth, essentially what we're calling universal basic income at this point. So he was this very progressive guy, very close with Malthus's father. So young Thomas, of course, had to say, "Dad, you're wrong, and here's why."
Prove you wrong.
And his father encouraged him to write an essay explaining his ideas. And Malthus was like in his early 20s when he wrote that.
The population essay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
I didn't know that at all. Interesting.
Yeah, so it all gets so Darwinism gets co-opted into this argument. Like, oh, look, nature, it's all red, bloody red in tooth and claw. It's all competition. That's how species adapt and advance, by killing one another.
Which is nonsense.
Yeah, it's nonsense. Yeah. Darwin would say it was nonsense. He did say it was nonsense.
Yeah.
But again, the utility of the argument is more important than the integrity of the argument.
True.
Yeah. So.
And there you have the whole psychological underpinnings of modern philosophy. So Adam Smith and John Locke took all that stuff, and I think actually Locke was before Darwin. So
although Adam Smith also wrote about cooperation being more important than competition, and how it hurts us to see another person
There's mixed
suffer.
messages in there.
Well, he wrote two major essays, right? There was.
It was Wealth of Nations.
Wealth of Nations.
Then there was that second one, that's where he introduced
the other one that's much more about the cooperation and
which is where he introduced the invisible hand as well. I remember that. Because he mentioned it more times in the other essay. But But Smith wasn't a nefarious figure whatsoever, but it represents a point in time, and the idea of the invisible hand has been, I guess you could say, exaggerated. Because in the extremity of it, you have this quaint idea of self-regulation in the system, which implies voluntary exchange and that things work out if people act in their own self-interest. It sounds democratic, but then it got turned into what's now neoliberalism.
Right.
So now the whole world must abide by, and of course this is the general philosophy of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank. Pretty much you are a neoliberal entity, and if you're not, then you're going to see the wrath of the rest of the neoliberal world, because you must be a dictatorship. You see this rhetoric from Cuba to Iran to Venezuela. It's really unfortunate on that macro level that those societies that, to whatever discredit they deserve, still have tried to do something a little bit different. And we've been weeding this out ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the hegemony of the capitalist structure prevailed, even though it was really done through tremendous sabotage against the Soviet Union. The mythology of communism as it existed historically is ever pervasive and completely quite wrong when it comes to Western education.
What would you say is wrong? What are the salient points that we get wrong?
There are problems in communism. Existed it was an attempt to have semi-autocratic control in a planned economy, but people still used money, and they still had trade with the external. So if you restrict trade, just like we restricted trade with Cuba, the standard operating procedure of the embargo, and you start to mess with an entire society and not allow them to import, then you are going to destabilize internally. And then there's the propaganda, of course, of all the death tolls. So the Black Book of Communism, this big held up, pro-capitalist book that says 100 million people died due to communism. They don't talk about that largely it was due to famines. And those famines are consequential of the global economy and the global issues that were happening between the West and the Soviet Union. In other words, there are other factors that were creating the death tolls.
Right.
Not to mention that death toll is largely exaggerated. I want to throw this out there because I get this argument all the time with people that get these polarized ideas between communism and capitalism. And they can't see any nuance between the two. In capitalism, the signature attribute is economic inequality, right? That is the birth of classism and the Neolithic Revolution.
Right.
So you didn't have that before. And consequentially, you have poverty and socioeconomic inequality. And this is done by an analysis, Kohler and Alcott, if I remember their names being pronounced correctly, in the 1970s, they analyzed what death tolls based on average lifespan were being created through inequality, unnecessarily so. And they estimated 18 million people died. This is a long time ago, but the statistic still holds true. I did a recent analysis of it. 18 million people, conservatively speaking, die because of unnecessary condition due to what's called structural violence. It was done through the Gandhi Institute. Also another figure is Johan Galtung. He's another one that presented this information. So 18 million people die every year effectively due to the inequality generated by the capitalist structure, which means that in less than 6 years, more people die because of capitalism than the entire century of communism. And I think I don't state that to support communism. I state that to show the crazy relativity that people have. When people think of violence, they think of a gun pointed to your head.
Right.
But there's a deeper, much more insidious form of violence that comes from the structure.
Exactly.
Through chain reactions. We're all pulling these levers on a giant machine.
Yeah.
And we don't realize that our little self-interested mechanisms are supporting a system that's putting out an exhaust of death and destruction. And, poverty said it, Gandhi said it the best, poverty is the worst form of violence.
Right.
And that can't be understated.
So you must have some interesting ideas about the argument Steven Pinker advances.
Which ones?
Well, in the Better Angels of Our Nature, I think, his last book about how we live in the most peaceful era in the existence of the
it's
species.
Funny. I didn't read that book, but I did read The Blank Slate. And Pinker is a unique character. There's some things I agree with. Some things feel ideologically driven to me.
Woo.
Yeah. I had a conversation with some other scientists about him. But anyway, so if you want to say we're in the most peaceful period of society, you have to ignore effectively all structural violence.
As he does.
And, it's even more interesting. I read an article that said that book effectively, because of the recent surge of deaths and the genocides and the refugee crisis and what's been happening over the course of the past, I guess he wrote that book like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Since that time, someone wrote that actually it's debunked now, statistically.
Just even using his statistical
framework. There's no longer in the most peaceful society. Yeah. And even what makes the worst to me, I call them techno-capitalist apologists broadly. These are the folks that see this gainsaying. They describe this gainsaying over the course of time. And they tend to be of a, academically elite class, or they have a lot of wealth and influence and have great stature. And even folks like Jeremy Rifkin and Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis and a lot of the technologist guys in Singularity, or other folks that I could list, they have this tendency to not see the central problem, which is a power system that doesn't care, that will continue to preserve itself at the expense of the general population.
Yeah.
And because of that, all trajectories are basically negative right now. There's a long-term progressive trajectory, that's great, but all the trajectories within this final little moment are all going down.
Yeah.
You have all life support systems in decline.
Yeah.
You have a growing refugee crisis that's 65 million. There's no resolution of that in sight, which will definitely spiral into other problems, resulting to that. You have this new isolationism that is a terrible sign towards fascism, such as Trump wanting to build a wall, Brexit. You have all of these things that are starting to pile in there that lead to two conclusions, especially with the withdrawal of the Paris Accord, that there's really no momentum towards any of these things being resolved in the immediate future without something very dramatic happening. Like everything's in retrograde.
Yeah, and you're still working within the presumption that they could be solved. The thing about points of no return is that sometimes you pass them.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But nobody wants to talk that way.
I guess
I love how everyone's like this argument of like, well, I have to be an optimist because I have kids. Like, that's not rational.
That's not rational, no.
You don't have to be.
Well, here's the way I see it. Then I see collapse occurring on multiple levels, and I also see the potential for if there was a galvanized community for change. But I think what's most probable is you're going to have the continual collapse. I don't believe in a global collapse because it's not perceivable. So I talk to people like, well, we got to wait for something really bad to happen, and everyone will wake up. I don't think people really work that way. I mean, there are those pressures that will change people, that are shock events. But I think that when it comes to the global phenomenon, like how many more? We already have close to 1 billion people starving. Again, 65 million refugees. Yeah. What else? What extremity?
Right.
What about 3 billion? Do people really going to care in the West?
What's it going to take?
Yeah.
I always thought like we need a hurricane to hit DC and sort of like, oh shit, that's real.
Sure.
But it hit New York, the superstorm, Storm Sandy or whatever it was.
Right.
Like how many perfect fucking storms do we need to have?
Sure.
They're all perfect at this point. Sebastian Junger must feel weird about that.
Who?
Sebastian Junger. He invented the phrase "the perfect storm."
He
wrote
okay.
the book about it.
Right.
And now it's everywhere. Like it's weird to see it.
So my point being is there's no real moment of realization, except for an educational requirement to get people, again, why the book was written, to get people to understand that there is a direction if there's a galvanized community to move forward.
There's a way. There's a place to go.
There is hope.
Yeah.
Now, probabilistically, whether we get there, I'd say the probabilities are against us. My catchphrase is the kind of change that's required will happen one way or another. It just depends on how much suffering has to incur before it does.
That's what I was saying earlier.
Yeah, right.
I think we as a species will get to a sustainable place, but there might be 50,000 of us, and it might be on a planet that's 80% uninhabitable.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was referring to this essay earlier. We got sidetracked, which is great. The whole point of this podcast is to get sidetracked.
Good.
But I think it would be a useful thing for you as a metaphor. The guy talks about, I think the essay is called "The Selfish Me Must Die" or something, or "The Selfish Gene Must Die," and he sort of gets into the Dawkins selfish gene thing, which of course is hugely ideologically driven. It's not accurate scientifically speaking, but it's very useful for capitalists to think about. And anyway, he talks about how he was at a conference and he just happened to walk into this guy who was talking about locusts, and he was talking about a species of locust that's in North Africa that's the sort of biblical plague of locusts.
Sure.
Locusts,
yeah,
right?
Locust.
And it turns out that this locust begins life as a grasshopper, and many of them will live and die as grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are dispersed. People have heard me talk about this before, so I'll try to boil it down. But they live independently. They're chill. They don't attack each other, whatever.
Right.
Then the rains come. There's lots of green, and the population expands rapidly. Then the rain stops. The green starts to reduce. So the population density of these grasshoppers increases, and it gets to a point where the population density triggers dormant genes.
Wow.
And now the individual grasshoppers transform into locusts, not over generations. It's like a Mr. Jekyll or Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing.
Fascinating.
And so their front legs get shorter, their back legs get longer, their coloration changes, their head changes shape, and they become very aggressive. They start attacking each other, they become cannibalistic, and then they start to swarm.
That's amazing.
So the swarms are millions of these locusts trying to bite the one in front and the one behind trying to bite you.
Right.
It's fucking capitalism. It's this hyper-competitive.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, and they swarm across North Africa. They eat everything.
Right.
And then when nothing's left, 95% of them die. The 5% that are left go back to being grasshoppers.
Do they really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. I had no idea.
So that's my vision of the future. That there will be some grasshoppers, but it's going to take a giant die-off, unfortunately. I mean, my thing is we are at this, when I'm trying to be hopeful,
right?
And I think maybe you and I converge on this a little bit. I'm trying to be hopeful. I say, look, we're at this moment where we have a world brain for the first time, this internet. I mean, this is so weird that you and I can have this conversation. We can say anything we want, and then I push a few buttons, and 100,000 people can listen to it, or a million, or whatever. But at least 100,000 will, right?
Sure.
And it's archived forever. It's freely accessible. There's no password. You don't have to be white. You don't have to be a man.
Right,
you don't
right.
have to. So
incredible.
yeah, that's an incredible moment in human history. It's never existed before. No. And we also have technology for creating passive energy. We have the technology for controlling population without killing anybody. Right, we can get vasectomies. We can, there's all sorts of birth control.
You can also change the precondition, as you pointed out earlier, where if you actually get people out of poverty, their numbers now lower in contrast to the Malthusian view.
Well, and my dream is to try to combine population control with universal basic income, because so many people, as you know, have kids as a way to sort of provide for them in their old age.
Sure.
If you're like, look, everybody in the world is going to get the equivalent of $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month in your local economy forever, you don't need to have a bunch of kids.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, the fewer kids you have, the more money you'll get.
That's a good incentive as
build
well.
an incentive in, like, hey, you didn't have any kids, you're doing a good thing for the planet, here's an extra $500 a month.
Yeah.
Well, people are going to stop having kids.
Yeah, that would be a great incentive, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're right. That touches upon a lot of sensitive issues. I'm at an age now where I see all my friends having kids, and I ask them, so why?
Yeah.
And their response generally is they have that biological need. I know that females seem to have the biological clock. That seems to be relatively well established. Do you agree with that? That there's a general gravitation as women mature that they gravitate towards wanting to have kids, or is that more of a cultural issue, do you think?
I mean, I'm not a woman. I can't speak to that experience.
But there's been some studies I thought.
I have plenty of women friends who say, never,
me too.
Never happened.
Me too. But at the same time, I know.
But let's look at it,
Okay.
from the way I look at things, right? So I look at that, I say, okay, wait. Now, we're calling that a biological impulse to have children. What if that's a biological impulse to be nurturant and to be around children? What if it's not about having children? And I think that's I did an interview one time with a woman, and I was saying something about how hunter-gatherer paternity is, we assume it's sort of built into the evolutionary psychology view that men are very concerned with paternity, and so they would only share resources with a woman who's only having sex with them, and it's this whole,
right.
the basis of this argument, which I found in my research to be totally baseless.
Okay.
And I was talking about that with her, and there are societies in the Amazon who believe that a fetus is literally made of accumulated semen.
That's right. I remember that from your TED Talk.
Yeah. So the idea that one sex act could create a baby is not well established.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Anyway, so I was talking about this and talking about how in hunter-gatherer societies and other societies, even agrarian societies, often paternal responsibility for a child is not biologically determined. It's the mother's brother who has to take care of the child, or it's a clan system where, oh, you're in the Otter clan, well, that means I'm going to take care of you.
Right.
And so this assumption that the nuclear family is this sort of essential unit of human social organization is totally without basis. Anyway, she said, I adopted a kid 2 years ago. And I had a child biologically a couple of years before that. And I can tell you, there's no difference.
Yeah.
There's no difference. I held that baby. I love that baby just as much as the one that came out of my body. There's no difference.
Sure.
So the biological clock, I might look at it and say, we evolved in small hunter-gatherer bands where if there's a baby, everyone's taking care of it. I see a baby, I want to pick him up and play with him and hold him and protect him and teach him, and it's not my baby, so why do I feel that?
Yeah.
So I would argue that it's not a biological clock. I would argue that women and men, but women to a greater extent, want to be around kids, want to help kids, want to protect them, want to feed them, want to, and the only way to do that in this world is to have your own,
right?
Because we live in these weird fragmented units.
It's true. It's lack of tribalness.
Yeah, a lack of tribal community.
Well, so then I asked them. I guess that's where that. I agree with that. I think there's the nurturing tendency. There's that need for just that, as opposed to something that you own or a child.
I mean, cat ladies. Why do they have 20 cats?
Yeah, that's true.
You know,
or pet owners in general. I think
yeah,
it's
exactly. Yeah.
there's probably some truth to the fact that people that don't have kids tend to get pets.
You're my baby, oh my little baby. Oh.
But I will say that there is something to say about there's something about culture that people develop an emptiness in this culture,
Yeah,
and I think that they have to fill that void. And I think
Right.
once they reach this kind of age, children seem to be something that fills it. And I'm not sure if that's
money,
money. Yeah,
you know.
I'm not sure if that's necessarily healthy.
Yeah.
You know, it's a difficult subject. You know,
Well, I think what I've seen, and this relates back to the whole economic argument that we began this conversation around. I have seen a lot of people whose lives are essentially meaningless, and they're smart enough to know that what they're doing is bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
They're, you know, managing fucking office buildings
Right.
or whatever it is. You know, at best is meaningless.
Yeah.
At worst is destructive and horrible.
degrading.
And how do they make it meaningful? Have kids.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I do this because I'm taking care of this kid.
Yeah.
This kid's going to change the world. This kid's going to be great, and I have to pay for college so he can, you know, become. Yeah. Come on, man. This is all you're just offloading all your own personal responsibility onto this poor little kid who doesn't. And also, whoever said that not existing is worse than existing?
Exactly.
It's not like by not having a kid you're killing a kid. You're
Well,
just
I
not-
make the argument in the book. You know, we have a moral debate of abortion.
Yeah.
You could say, you know, in isolated terms, okay, well, if you don't believe that people should be killed and you want to conceive of the human life from fertilization to death,
Yeah.
then clearly you have a continuum, and where you draw that line is very subjective.
Right.
Obviously, birth creates a social reality for the child. And as we've learned about ourselves, we are deeply social,
Yeah.
and it creates an extension of the individual. So obviously, it has to start from that point, but
But it's not obvious.
it's not obvious. No, it's a moral decision. It's a moral view.
I
I
would-
agree with that.
and-
But there are factors.
Yeah.
Which make the argument stronger. I'll put it that way.
Right.
But my central point, and beyond that, was, what if you had a child? You know, you're born into poverty. Again, a low socioeconomic status. Born into a family that can't support the child. They're in a state that doesn't allow abortion, and then that breeds a child full of neurotic tendencies, neuroses that eventually harms other people in adulthood.
Right.
So where does the moral defense come at that point?
Yeah.
And that's what no one talks about in this sort of myopic view
Yeah.
of that subject
Well,
particularly.
see, I would argue that again, that gets back to my whole sort of meta
Mm-hmm.
organism thing. I would argue that kid is good for the mega organism.
Uh-huh.
It's not good for us because, as you say, that kid's going to cause damage, whatever.
Serial
But
killer,
what's
so
it
on.
do? It reduces labor rate because you've got the excess labor pool of all these uneducated poor. It creates war. You've got plenty of soldiers.
Cannon fodder.
You send them off to war. Their lives are meaningless. They have no options.
Yeah.
They're looking for someone. They're angry.
Yep.
They're sexually frustrated. There's a great connection between sexual frustration and violence.
Sure.
So it serves the purpose of the superorganism.
Of the
It
structure.
doesn't, yeah,
Yeah,
serve the
yeah.
purpose of the society necessarily.
Right.
But the thing I was going to say about that whole abortion and birth thing that's I find fascinating, because I get into this with debunking the notion that we've doubled the human lifespan.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
You know, which still is hugely popular notion.
Sure.
And anytime I talk to people, you know, questioning the notion of progress, the first thing they'll come out with is like, "Come on, dude, you know, we're not dying from fucking cholera anymore." You know, and like antibiotics, and yeah, I have to explain to them like
Those
those
macro
are
gain
band-aids
saves.
over wounds we've caused ourselves
Sure.
with civilization, and this idea that we're living twice as long. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it's basically it's misinformation. It's based on a misunderstanding of archaeological reports because dental eruption stops at 35, and so you can't tell age of death beyond 35 but archaeologists understand that just means 35 up to whatever.
Right.
But the journalists were like, "Oh, look, nobody was over 35 again." You know?
Hey, more stuff to support our system.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't look at it. But my other point was, infant mortality is a big part of those calculations as well. So they find a bunch of dead infants, and it's true. Hunter-gatherers, infants die. About 50%
Yeah.
of infants die, or children die before the age of 10.
Right.
Which obviously is way higher than in our world.
Definitely.
But a lot of those infant deaths were infanticide.
Really?
Yeah, because population control. They didn't. If twins were born, most hunter-gatherers, they won't raise twins.
Interesting.
Because there's just not enough food and time and whatever, and they'll let one die. And if a child's born with any sort of ailment, any sort of my microphone just fell, any sort of physiological deformity or whatever, they'll let the child die.
Yeah.
And they don't believe. Most hunter-gatherers don't believe an infant is a person. In fact, most hunter-gatherers don't believe an infant becomes a person until they can speak.
Interesting.
So letting an infant die for them is essentially abortion.
Yeah.
But when we calculate our own longevity, we don't include abortions.
Right.
And millions of kids are getting aborted. Kids, whatever you want to call them.
That's an excellent point.
In China and India, just because they're girls, for
right,
example,
right.
But certainly if there are physical deformities, a lot of those kids are being not born.
Yeah.
So statistically, it's just a totally dishonest conversation.
I hear that statistic. Oh, we've reduced child mortality by X%, and that must be such a great sign of our progress.
Yeah, although it's going the wrong way.
Even if it were true in what even if it were true in the stats that we see, is that really the ultimate sign of progress as a civilization? Right. I mean, infant mortality, and going back to my argument of what actually defines a person.
Right.
What is it? We are a collection of cells. We go through the biological process, but that doesn't really make us human as far as I'm concerned. It has to be a social relationship. I mean, metaphorically human. It has to be, you have to be identified. You have to be identified by your parents and by your tribe. And I think to me, that's why we generally intuitively don't honor death, at least, you have capital punishment and war and all these loopholes. But generally speaking, we outlaw people murdering each other because we know that there's a social relationship and we know that will spark other negative effects. You have retributive murders.
Right.
There's a destabilizing force when you have a society that's willing to kill itself.
Right.
And I think that is a kind of that's not talked about enough in this kind of basic utility of stability of a society. Yeah. You know what I mean? So the moral arguments, I think, fall flat in a lot of ways. People need to think more in terms of what works and what doesn't in terms of the goals of a society. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you don't want to live in a warfare society or gangland society because it just fuels more gangland activity and warfare. Right. So hence we create rules and laws that organize around that, and we create moral bullshit to try and convince us. I say we in the sense of this sort of intuition that we've generated to convince us that it's a moral issue. I think that detracts from the logic of it. I often, ethics and morality are important, I think, to communicate to kids and people just so they have a fundamental basis, but that knowledge has to have its foundation, something that actually works and something that actually has utility in the sense that it's functional. It can't just be a whimsical idea of what's right and wrong. Right. And it's too bad that we still have the religious dogmas and things like that impose these moral overarching terms that no one even knows what they're doing.
And they work against us. For example, the religious strictures against sexual expression. Sure. As I said earlier, there is an established connection between sexual frustration and violence.
Pedophile priests,
fucking Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the whole Islamic jihad. Those guys aren't getting laid, and they're being told that in heaven you're going to have all these virgins.
What a fucking amazingly misogynistic idea. The 1,000 virgins or whatever. Yeah. Stunning. Yeah. Stunning.
Do you know who Robert Sapolsky is?
Oh, of course. I interviewed him for my third film.
Oh, yeah.
I quote him in the book, too.
He's great.
He's great.
Do you know his story about the baboons who got sick?
I do. That's an excellent study.
Yeah, and it really kind of makes me hopeful. That's as far as looking for shreds of hope.
Absolutely. If in a single generation they can change their behavior.
Right.
Because the alphas were died off, for those that are listening.
Yeah.
There was a story of the alphas that were very aggressive naturally in a baboon troop, and they died off due to an accident. And then what happened, because that alpha pressure wasn't there, everyone became far more egalitarian. Yeah. And what I love best about that is that when the
new males came in,
were acclimated. Exactly. Now, if they can do that, then
it's the power of culture.
Power of our prefrontal cortex should be able to kick in here.
Yeah.
It's something that our primate brethren don't have the option of as much.
Yeah.
To be conscious, you think that we could do a whole lot better now.
You know about the Fermi paradox?
No.
So Enrico Fermi, one of the physicists who worked on the Manhattan Project, was hanging out with some other super genius friends having lunch, and they were talking about the possibility of there being extraterrestrial life. And so, these are like, 5 Nobel Prize winners having lunch, right? So he's like, well, okay, wait, how many, stars in the galaxy, and how many of those stars are of the proper type that there could be orbiting planets, and how many of those, statistically, what's the probability of those, of a planet being in the right sort of margin of temperature so there could be water on the planet. We know there's ice floating around in space, so if they've existed long enough, that ice is going to accumulate. So sort of doing that statistical analysis, he came up with some incredibly large number of planets where life could have originated.
That's right, I remember this now.
And then he says, where is everyone? Right? Like, we know if there are 700 trillion planets where life could have originated, there's no reason to think this is the only one where it happened, right? That's ridiculous. Occam's razor would never go there.
Right.
So you say, well, it's happened. Let's say it's happened on half of them already, right? Let's say we're sort of statistically in the middle. So that means there are a lot of them that have existed for hundreds of millions of years. So they're far more advanced than us. Where the fuck are they? And so the answer, you mentioned Elon Musk earlier. He's written about this, and Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking. The answer that most people have come up with is that there's what they call the Great Filter, which is that there's a point where societies, civilizations, and you talk about this explicitly in your work, where the technological capabilities are far beyond the moral and social maturity, right? So it's like giving a machine gun to a chimpanzee. Eventually, he's going to shoot everybody, right? And so these societies reach that point, they wipe themselves out, and that's why we haven't heard from anyone, because there's like almost like a Malthusian thing. There's this built-in difference between technological advancement, you could say it advances exponentially, and the moral thing, which advances arithmetically, and so you just get this disjuncture and it wipes out.
Yep.
So in the context of this book I'm working on now, I've come to this idea that that's probably true in many cases, but there's another option, which is, and you sort of gestured toward it earlier, Joseph Campbell?
Oh, yeah.
So Joseph Campbell's big idea was that every society's origin myth is essentially the same story, the prodigal son, or whatever, the hero's journey, he calls it, where the person goes out, leaves their society, leaves the thing they know, they go out and they learn all these lessons and have all these challenges, and then at the end they return home. As T.S. Eliot said, the end of all our explorations will be to return to where we began and know the place for the first time.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah.
So I put all these things together, and my idea is the societies that don't wipe themselves out reach a point where they say, the best place for us to be is here, where we started, not out there.
Yeah.
And there's nothing we need out there. What we need is simply to take care of this place, because every organism is going to thrive best in the place, in the context that gave rise to it.
Sure.
A cactus wants to be in the desert. An orchid wants to be in the jungle. You take a
we'd
cactus
have to work
and
so hard to replicate this environment on another planet.
Why even bother?
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm so glad you brought. I identify with Hawking because in his cynicism, he's like, well, we got to get the hell out of here because we're not going to survive otherwise. So he's projecting that the species will destroy itself, and those that get off will be surviving. But then there's the Musks and such that want to terraform. Yeah. And that's where I'm like, wow, man, why can't we use these resources and energy and science to focus on saving what we have?
Right.
I do cringe when I hear people wanting to do all these experimental, exploratory things.
Because it's just run faster.
It's
just, instead of turning and facing the fucking monster, we're just learning to run faster and faster, and we're never going to get away.
Especially in a class-based society, and again, I follow all the fruits of technology and people that are so overly optimistic in certain ways, such as, genetic engineering, and we'll be able to help kids, but who's going to have those options? The wealthy are. Yeah. It's the wealthy that will go to terraformed Mars. It's the wealthy that will be able to live for another 100 years if that's possible. And that's frightening because it creates, again, that elitist separation that can only cause conflict. I mean, we think class is bad now. Imagine when there are people walking around that have certain biological advantages because they could afford to alter themselves in utero. I find that terrifying. Yet the academic intelligentsia and the pro-technologist folks never touch upon that.
Yeah.
That you can't.
Yeah.
We can't expect stability to occur in this type of class structures. It has to be separated. It has to be removed. One way or another, people have to realize that socioeconomic inequality, as I state in the book, is the most destructive force in human society right now. And I separate that a little bit from the ecological, which most focus on, because the end result of the ecological crisis will be more socioeconomic inequality. Whether it's the poor of the world getting poorer, whether it's more tropical diseases down south, those are the ones that suffer from all of this first,
Right.
pushing more refugees, more violence, more terrorism.
Right.
And who are they going to focus on where all the concentration of wealth and power is? And it's just everything points to
The
instability.
sooner the better.
Well, unfortunately, what is it about the fact that people are going into, and I'm being cynical and sarcastic, but you see very little aggression to go to the power establishment directly or the elitist business class.
Well, I was
They
going
all-
to ask
it's
you
all just-
earlier, what do you think of the Unabomber? Have you read his manifesto?
I've not read his manifesto, no.
It makes a lot of sense, man.
Does it really? Well, I bet you a lot of these guys that have philosophical underpinnings that finally rebel have kernels of truth to it. There's a great book you should read by Federico Berardi. It's called Heroes. And it's Heroes, Mass Murder and Suicide, something, something, something. And it's an analysis of all the mass murderers from the very rare case of the guy in Sweden, I can't remember his name, he killed all those kids, who identified completely with right-wing isolationist policies.
Yeah.
But yet within his huge manifesto, you find kernels of truth of things that are acknowledged in the sense, obviously I'm not advocating any of that, but he goes through and talks about the underpinning of what happens to people when they take that kind of journey, their sense of loss, their lack of inclusion, their outrage, even the kids like Diebold, Dylan, and the Columbine guys.
Right.
He goes through their work and analyzes what it is that sets people into that trajectory. And it ultimately, his conclusion is that you can have a competitive neoliberal society and not expect these side effects. And that's, in the more inequality and the more class divides, the more isolationist, the more winning people see, the more competitive, the more, as a side effect, you are going to get the extremities of Islamic terrorism. The more you're going to get more mass shootings. I mean, going postal, my father used to be a postal worker before he retired. And he talked about the condition in the post office and how it had this breeding ground for an antagonism because of the way the state corporate structure was set up. And it was absolutely no surprise when people finally flipped out in the 80s.
Really?
And pulled out guns. And that was the very first of real mass shootings in the U.S.
Yeah,
People
I
forget
remember that expression.
And then it suddenly started to move into other businesses. And again, you have this, the ground foundation of neoliberal capitalism, or capitalism in general, neoliberalism is just more exaggerated. It's an intolerant view on the global level. But is that you're alone. You're alone and you have to compete. And from that kernel seed comes the complete antisocial dynamic.
Yeah.
And it's sad to me that every time someone pulls out a gun in some, random place, zero psychologists are coming forward to make any relationship to this.
Yeah.
Because it's like tuberculosis, Just because you're exposed to it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to develop the disease.
Right.
It's a smaller portion of people across population level that will be those catalysts of destruction. And yet no one sees that. And that's troubling to me.
Yeah, definitely. There was something you said that I fucking lost it.
Well, there's one other thing I want to mention before I forget. Please. It's just an aside.
I got it. Go ahead.
I just read recently that in Nordic Scandinavian countries they've done so well and they've been under the radar with their approaches in public health. And over the course, I believe, the past 10 years, they've been reducing child drug abuse and alcoholism in I can't remember the exact country, but it goes down by 80%. And they said all they did was create extracurricular, as they described it, activities in the community and made it open and free so the kids can go and actually have communal presence and engage in arts and sciences. And look in the United States, we've been cutting the budgets for all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And they were able to reduce drug abuse and alcoholism by 80%.
Yeah.
It's so fundamental, but yet so lost. Anyway, go on.
Well, see, that's the thing. I think we misunderstand the incentives of society. Our society, if we wanted to reduce drug abuse or we wanted to reduce violence or teen pregnancy and so on, There are well-established ways to do that.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
it's the premise is wrong that we want to. You and I want to, but the society doesn't want to because it would, and that's where I get into this systemic thing where it's like, people say to me, "Oh, come on, man, you're too hard on the oil companies," or there are good people who work at Exxon, and like, yeah, okay, there may be good people who work at Exxon, but I always say if the CEO of Exxon went down to Peru with his son and did an ayahuasca experience and had an epiphany and came, like you had, and came back and said, "Holy shit, we got to stop this deep water drilling. We can't. This is wrong," he'd be out before lunch. And if the board happened to agree with him, they'd be out.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if they're good people because people don't run companies. Companies run people.
Yeah.
That's the self-driving bus.
It's structuralism.
Yeah,
That's as Gandhi said. There's a big quote on the Gandhi Institute by Johan Galtung that describes you can't blame the colonizers. They were involved in a structure that supported their agent as an agent of that structure, and it's a profoundly humanizing thing to view people like that because it stops that ridiculous polarization that fills our media, that fills the general academic community, it filled the entire legal systems premised on that. Absent of all public health science, absent of anything of causality of what happens to kids, absent of anything related to poverty, people still, what was it? One of the spokesmen today for the Trump administration, last week for Trump administration, said that the crime in Chicago is out of control, and it's obviously a law enforcement issue and a moral problem. Now that is just as archaic as you can get.
Right.
There's hideous poverty and socioeconomic inequality.
Right.
And there's other things to be said about that too in terms of socioeconomic inequality and its effect. If you're familiar with the Spirit Level with
Spirit Level, I have it right over there.
And that's
it's fantastic.
It is, and it shows it indicts class directly because we've been arguing class as an innovation motivator. Remember, that's what we're taught. Oh, well, you see people with a lot, you want to get to that point, which means you have to innovate and do something good for society, which is a complete myth. But the truth is, the more class separation you perceive, the more anxiety you generate, the more destruction. So it's you go to these cultures that haven't been polluted by media and TV, and they're so happy. They live in minimalistic environments, and their happiness index is off the chart. But the moment you throw them, there's something about something about our psychology in general. The moment you throw them into a society where they see all of this excess and things they don't have, things they never even thought of, suddenly it pollutes and just creates destabilization, not only in the mind but in the society.
Although those people generally reject the option to join this society.
Oh yeah, if they can.
Yeah,
it's hard to escape now. It's hard to escape now in the global community that it is. And going back to that minimalism, there's something else I was going to say. I completely forgot.
Good. We'll take turns forgetting what we were going to say, and then I'll cover for you now. I just want to read this. This is a wonderful book I talk about a lot. It's called "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes" by Daniel Everett.
Okay.
He's a linguist who went and lived with these. He went as a missionary initially, and he ended up living for I think 25 years with the Pinaha people of the Upper Amazon.
Yeah, that's right. I'm reading about them. Are they still around? Do you know?
Yeah, they are. But of course, it's harder and harder all the time. But this is. He says, if your life is unthreatened, as far as you know, and everyone in your society is satisfied, why would you desire change? How could things be improved? Especially if the outsiders you came into contact with seem more irritable and less satisfied with life than you. I once asked the Pinaha during my early missionary years if they knew why I was there. They said, "You're here because this is a beautiful place. The water is pretty. There are good things to eat here. The Pinaha are nice people." That was and is the Pinaha perspective. Life is good. Their upbringing, everyone learning early on to pull their own weight, produces a society of satisfied members. This is hard to argue against.
It is.
Yeah.
And that goes to show that it's really the sense of social inclusion.
Right.
That's really the wealth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Elsewhere, he says, the Pinaha laugh about everything. They laugh at their own misfortune. When someone's hut blows over in a rainstorm, the occupants laugh louder than anyone. They laugh when they catch a lot of fish. They laugh when they catch no fish. They laugh when they're full. They laugh when they're hungry. Since my first night among them, I've been impressed with their patience and happiness and kindness. This pervasive happiness is hard to explain, though I believe the Pinaha are so confident and secure in their ability to handle anything that their environment throws at them that they can enjoy whatever comes their way. This is not because their lives are easy, but because they're good at what they do. So we live in this world that's changing so quickly, none of us are prepared for it. You know, here I am struggling with this technology that didn't exist 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And then 2 years from now, I'll have to learn a new thing, you know?
And why is that? It's because of the social inclusion. What materialism has got the Western civilization specifically by the balls. Because the more something comes forward, the more people start to incorporate it,
Right.
and the more you're left behind if you don't as well.
Right, you
like
need
I
to
have this
join in.
this stupid
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
I don't care about any of the features on this
He's
thing in
holding up
truth.
his cell phone, by
Yeah,
the way.
I am.
The
And
iPhone 7, I believe. Brought to you by Apple.
And you know, I was the last, in fact, to get a cell phone back in the day
No,
because
me
I thought
too.
to myself,
I
I was like,
resisted
I
it.
don't want this. I don't want people bugging
And
me.
the early
I don't want
adopters
my
were
bosses
all
calling
dicks.
me. Yeah.
Yeah, they all had their holsters
Oh my
and
god.
shit.
And the only reason you did it because eventually your friends are like, oh, I tried to call you.
Yeah.
And, oh, I got to show you this thing, or
Yeah.
I need my GPS, and
Yeah,
suddenly.
yeah.
And now no one remembers anything. No one can get around anymore.
Right.
You know, we're so dependent in a very negative sense on technology. And again, I'm very pro the positive attributes of it. If we can stabilize the development of technology in the sense of its purpose,
Yeah.
not the frivolousness of it, not the vanity of it,
Yeah.
not the extraneous things that are giving people ADD.
Have you heard of Tristan Harris?
I know the name actually.
Yeah, he was on Sam Harris's podcast. He was on the Bill Maher show. He worked at Google. He's a technology ethicist.
Okay, I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not familiar with him.
Really interesting guy. The episode with Sam Harris is well worth listening to, and he gets into this thing about how his argument is technology is not neutral. That's, you know, everyone says it's a tool, you can use it for good, you can use it for. He's like, no,
Okay.
there are hundreds of engineers whose only job at each of these apps is to get you to spend more time there.
Yeah.
Because this is an attention economy, and your attention is the commodity
Yep.
that everyone's trying to control. So it's not neutral.
Well, it could be neutral, but because of the incentives of marketing, it's not by any
Right.
means. No,
Right.
it's horrible.
Yeah.
It's look at, and not to mention the value of arbitrary things. We have, what is this thing called Snapchat,
Yeah.
and it has a value of billions of dollars in
Yeah.
the market.
He says, by
For
the way,
this-
that's the worst one.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
And it's all based on marketing embedded and the advertisement associations to what you're photographing.
Right.
And I'm thinking to myself as a former trader, I'm like, I can't believe this stupid arbitrary thing has a market value
Yeah.
of something like $6 to $8 billion.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, that if that isn't indicative of just a complete separation of reality and the abstraction of technology, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Not to mention all the other negative things. That's, again, it's in the hands of what we're doing now. Technology is a very negative force on multiple levels, and it worries
Yeah.
me very
Yeah.
much.
We've veered so far away from, we've wandered so far away from home that I kind of hope that, and again, I'm not aware of the extent of my own bias, so as no one really is,
Sure.
so who knows?
Sure.
But I feel like we're at this moment historically where enough, there's this quote I pull out all the time from Arthur Miller, who said, an era can be considered over when its basic illusions have been exhausted. And I feel like we are at a moment where the basic illusions of Western civilization are exhausted. A lot of people, 20 years ago this wasn't true, but now a lot of people are looking at the world and they're saying this doesn't work. This isn't working.
Yeah.
It's not working ecologically. It's not working economically. I'm not richer than my parents were. I'm not going to live as long as my parents. Things aren't getting better.
There are indeed states in the U.S. with declining lifespans.
Oh yeah, and even if you look at black people as a subset,
Sure.
their
Oh, yeah.
lifespan is equal to
Oh.
like Rwanda.
Oh, it's horrible.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And infant mortality and all that. So I do think it's this amazing moment where people are open to other ways of thinking. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the resonance that your film and hopefully this book will capitalize on.
Yeah. What I find is that people are angry and they do see the problems. The question is, do they know the solutions? And that's that's my goal
Yeah.
these days. That's why
Yeah.
people want to check the book out. I realized after complaining for years, if we can't present something to replace what is effectively a bad social psychology emanating down from our social system, overarching and ruining
Yeah.
and polluting, we're not going to get very far because we clearly the protests of the street, And the general activist community, as disparate as it is, it's all broken up and fragmented. The environmental activists, the human rights activists, the regional civil rights activists. You have this spread, and it's a divide and conquer phenomenon in the sense, from the perspective of the power establishment. As long as everyone's still fighting and separated and confused and isolated and myopic, then nothing will change.
Yeah.
And the elite preserve their positions. And,
Right.
But if they come together, and that's why they take the economic focus and demand and create, in fact, because in the new realm, we have the power to design and create in a way that we never had before. Like, imagine, and this is the kind of world that I envision, a participatory economics where you're connected to systems like CAD, computer-aided design and engineering, and you have these systems connected and networked to the resources of the region or the planet, and you're able to, in open source, actually design a phone. You're able to design anything. You can design a transit system. You can design the architecture of your society in open source, actively in real time. Always, collectively speaking, more minds are better than one if organized properly. There is a deep wisdom which is proven through open source.
The experiment with counting how many marbles are in the jar.
No.
Do you know that?
No.
It's an amazingly powerful thing. I think Daniel Kahneman might have written about it.
I've heard of it. What is it again?
So the experiment is they've got this big ass jar and they've got marbles or jelly beans or something, and there are thousands of them in there, right? And so they ask people to guess how many are in there, and of course it's way off. But when they get to, like, I don't know if it's 1,000 guesses or 5,000 guesses, there's a certain point at which the statistical average is extremely accurate.
Amazing. Yeah.
So there is exactly what you're saying. There is some wisdom in crowds that's demonstrable but incomprehensible somehow.
Well, you have again, back to the sharing nature of what has actually driven things forward. The sharing of ideas, not the hoarding, and the illusions.
Right.
So you have the historical development. What it took for this to be made, this phone, took effectively an eon of technological advancement and science. And yet we put a name on it, a brand on it, as though someone like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs magically came up with this, which is that individualistic neuroses that we have to get away from.
Yeah, you're right.
And at the same time, you have
externalization as well.
Yeah, and no one really perceives that. So in other words, when I mentioned this kind of participatory economic process, it would exponentially increase innovation. It would also remove the marketing focus that gets people to just buy things for the sake of somebody else's benefit. People falling victim to that cultural manipulation through advertising. So you eliminate all that. And you finally are able to establish a level playing field where it requires one fundamental shift, and that is the dramatic sharing of resources throughout a region or the world. The cool thing, though, with the rise of technology is that you won't need, due to more with less, what Buckminster Fuller called ephemeralization. Are you familiar with that term? It's the macro observation that over the course of time, due to design, the entire industrial complex gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you could imagine right here in Topanga, eventually, all the food being grown in advanced systems, while all the goods that you see are actually printed regionally as well, 3D printing through large industrial systems, large in the sense compared to, say, a normal 3D printer. But these systems that can be created locally create localization. And you tap into the design mechanism yourself if you care to, along with millions of others or whoever's in your region, and then you are able to build out this engagement, and then the goods are produced and so on. And in the highest extreme of that, there would be no money involved because it wouldn't be necessary once you reach that level of efficiency. Now that's clearly an idealism, but I think you could even do it in an existing economy, a mixed economy that we develop, where you just eliminate the corporate structure and start to use the actual advent of communication technology in a positive participatory way. That's what I pose in the book, which is far more detailed than what I just said. But if we can achieve even a kernel of that, those transitions, the 5 transitions are the use of automation over labor, because we can't keep people employed holistically. We need to focus on automation. It is what has produced the abundance that we've seen. And then there's the access society. Property has to be shut down, not in the sense that no one owns anything or has no rights, so to speak, in a legal sense, but way away from this property-based society we see, where we actually incentivize people to share cars, to share large systems, to return things to places where other people can use them, and in a more deliberate sense of recycling. Both grassroots in a sense and both high-tech as well. Then you have the open source mechanism. You need that. That's the driver of innovation. Get rid of corporations hoarding property. We need to actually understand what we have out there. We don't even know how much oil we have. No one's going to tell us the actual truth.
Right.
It's all these ridiculous projections. We don't even know anything about the resources of this planet because they're all being conditioned and excuse me, all being hoarded information-wise by corporations. They have no need to tell the public. In fact, they're against their interest to do so. People think diamonds are rare. They're not rare.
Yeah, no, it's
really
manufactured
ridiculous.
scarcity. Yeah.
So then you have localization, as I just implied. That's where people get away from globalization. You know, the average American food plate travels about 1,400 miles. It's lunacy.
Yeah.
The amount of hydrocarbons that goes into the strawberries that you could easily create through advanced agriculture and closed systems.
Yeah.
And then you have this kind of networked feedback system that implied when I talked about the design system that could be constructed, which basically tracks what people are doing. Because people have argued in historically in economic arguments, people like Ludwig von Mises, these where the libertarian foundations are, they say without money, without means of exchange and the preferences can't be understood. We can't understand supply and demand. We can't have the balance that we see, which is extremely crude actually in market economics. That's thoroughly gone and debunked because we have beautiful tracking sensor systems through the internet. You can imagine a Wi-Fi being created in a city that is connected to all the exchanges that happen without the need for actual currency. Again, that's the farthest extreme.
Kind of happening with credit cards.
It is.
And
It's already
phone
happening.
payments.
So that economic calculation problem, as he called it, which has been held up by this, more Ayn Rand, libertarian philosophy, that's thoroughly debunked.
Fuck Ayn Rand.
Yeah, fuck Ayn Rand.
Jesus, and Alan Greenspan.
The damage that she did is unbelievable.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Listen, we're coming up on 2 hours here,
right.
and it feels like 15 minutes.
I know.
I could pick your brain for days, man. I really enjoy this.
Absolutely, me too, man.
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you live in LA?
I do. Culver
So
City.
maybe we can do a part 2 one of these days.
Love
'Cause
to.
I feel like, I wanted to sort of get into the nitty gritty of like, okay, how is this going to come about? Because I know in your book you propose actual solutions. It's not just a sort of, whinging as my book is. So, I mean, I got to that point where it's like, okay, where's the prescriptive element? And I'm not comfortable with prescriptive
It's
elements.
hard.
Yeah.
Because the moment you do that, people's hair raise up.
You create a confrontational thing, and also, it starts to reduce. Like what I did in Sexaton, and what I'm trying to do in this book is just say, look, here's the problem. Here's a way of looking at it. Then use this to apply to your own life and figure out what works for you.
Yeah.
But the minute I'm saying like, oh, I think you should have an affair, or your wife should sleep with other men, or
that's
you
hard.
should masturbate more, or whatever, get the invisible hand in the bedroom, then it becomes a problem. So what I'm doing in this book is and in fact, maybe you can help me with this or put me in touch with people, but I'm looking for stories of people who have changed their lives by bringing their lives more into alignment with the principles of prehistoric life. So, for example, finding community and raising children together, or growing their own food and knowing where the food comes from. And they're not thinking like, oh, I'm going to have a paleo life, but they're finding like, oh, I feel so much better now.
Sure.
And my kids are happier. And so I'm going in a couple of days, I'm flying out to North Carolina to visit a farm where people are doing this. So I'm just going to tell stories.
So you've been to the kibbutz in Israel?
I've never been to a kibbutz.
I've never actually been. That I know people that grew up in the kibbutz.
Yeah.
And they didn't use money. It was all community driven.
Yeah.
That's a great example. Israel has, of course, a dark political history.
Yeah.
But as far as the existence of this old, ancient, social,
very tribal,
very unique,
kind
and and creative and fascinating.
And women like are autonomous and have, they're right up there with men. And
then there's all those events and stuff, things like Burning Man have become so popularized and commercialized now, but in its original start, everyone saw it as such a great enlightenment event because they're separating themselves from society.
Right.
People use a basic barter system.
Right, yeah.
And a gift system, actually, too.
Yeah.
They don't allow, at least I'm sure they do to some effect, but it's not intended to be any kind of sale-oriented environment. Yeah, I was going to do a documentary a long time called Counterculture. And it was all about people just living differently across the world, but I never got a chance to do it. So I'll go back to my notes. I can send you.
Maybe we'll spur each other on.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this, Matt.
Man.
I really enjoyed this.
Totally.
Yeah. I'm going to stop that and stop this.